Chapter 35 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 35. The Happy Pair. The dark blot on the street is gone. Mr. Dombey's mansion, if it be a gap among the other houses any longer, is only so because it is not to be vied with in its brightness, and haughtily casts them off. The saying is that home is home, be it never so homely. If it hold good in the opposite contingency, and home is home, be it never so stately, what an altar to the household gods is raised up here! Lights are sparkling in the windows this evening, and the ruddy glow of fires is warm and bright upon the hangings and the soft carpets, and the dinner waits to be served, and the dinner table is handsomely set forth, though only for 4 persons, and the sideboard is cumbrous with plate. It is the first time that the house has been arranged for occupation since its late changes, and the happy pair are looked for every minute. Only second to the wedding morning, in the interest and expectation it engenders among the household, is this evening of the coming home. Mrs. Perch is in the kitchen taking tea, and has made the tour of the establishment, and priced the silks and damasks by the yard, and exhausted every interjection in the dictionary, and out of it expressive of admiration and wonder. The upholsterer's foreman, who has left his hat with a pocket handkerchief in it, both smelling strongly of varnish, under a chair in the hall, lurks about the house, gazing upwards at the cornices and downward at the carpets, and occasionally, in a silent transport of enjoyment, taking a rule out of his pocket and skirmishingly measuring expensive objects with unutterable feelings. Cook is in high spirits and says, give her a place where there's plenty of company, as she'll bet you 6pence there will be now, for she is of a lively disposition, and she always was from a child, and she don't mind who knows it, which sentiment elicits from the breast of Mrs. Perch a responsive murmur of support and approbation. All the housemaid hopes is happiness for 'em. But marriage is a lottery, and the more she thinks about it, the more she feels the independence and the safety of a single life. Mr. Towlinson is saturnine and grim, and says that's his opinion too, and give him war besides, and down with the French, for this young man has a general impression that every foreigner is a Frenchman, and must be by the laws of nature. At each new sound of wheels they all stop whatever they are saying and listen, and more than once there is a general starting up and a cry of "Here they are!" But here they are not yet, and cook begins to mourn over the dinner which has been put back twice, and the upholsterer's foreman still goes looking about the rooms, undisturbed in his blissful reverie. Florence is ready to receive her father and her new mamma. Whether the emotions that are throbbing in her breast originate in pleasure or in pain she hardly knows, but the fluttering heart sends added colour to her cheeks and brightness to her eyes, and they say downstairs, drawing their heads together, for they always speak softly when they speak of her, "How beautiful Florence looks to-night! And what a sweet young lady she has grown, poor dear!" A pause succeeds, and then cook, feeling, as president, that her sentiments are waited for, wonders whether, and there stops. The housemaid wonders too, and so does Mrs. Perch, who has the happy social faculty of always wondering when other people wonder, without being at all particular what she wonders at. Mr. Towlinson who now descries an opportunity of bringing down the spirits of the ladies to his own level, says wait and see. He wishes some people were well out of this. Cook leads a sigh then, and a murmur of, "Ah, it's a strange world." It is indeed. And when it has gone round the table, adds persuasively, "But Miss Florence can't well be the worse for any change, Tom." Mr. Towlinson's rejoinder, pregnant with frightful meaning, is, "Oh, can't she though?" And sensible that a mere man can scarcely be more prophetic or improve upon that, he holds his peace. Mrs. Skewton, prepared to meet her darling daughter and dear son-in-law with open arms, is appropriately attired for that purpose in a very youthful costume with short sleeves. At present, however, her ripe charms are blooming in the shade of her own apartments, whence she has not emerged since she took possession of them a few hours ago, and where she is fast growing fretful on account of the postponement of dinner. The maid, who ought to be a skeleton, but is in truth a buxom damsel, is, on the other hand, in a most amiable state, considering her quarterly stipend much safer than heretofore, and foreseeing a great improvement in her board and lodging. Where are the happy pair for whom this brave home is waiting? Do steam, tide, wind, and horses all abate their speed to linger on such happiness? Does the swarm of loves and graces hovering about them retard their progress by its numbers? Are there so many flowers in their happy path that they can scarcely move along without entanglement in thornless roses and sweetest briar? They are here at last. The noise of wheels is heard, grows louder, and a carriage drives up to the door. A thundering knock from the obnoxious foreigner anticipates the rush of Mr. Towlinson and party to open it, and Mr. Dombey and his bride alight, and walk in arm. "My sweetest Edith!" cries an agitated voice upon the stairs. "My dearest Dombey!" And the short sleeves wreathe themselves about the happy couple in turn, and embrace them. Florence had come down to the hall too, but did not advance, reserving her timid welcome until the nearer and dearer transports should subside. But the eyes of Edith sought her out upon the threshold, and dismissing her sensitive parent with a slight kiss on the cheek, she hurried on to Florence and embraced her. "How do you do, Florence?" said Mr. Dombey, putting out his hand. As Florence, trembling, raised it to her lips, she met his glance. The look was cold and distant enough, but it stirred her heart to think that she observed in it something more of interest than he had ever shown before. It even expressed a kind of faint surprise, and not a disagreeable surprise, at sight of her. She dared not raise her eyes to his any more, but she felt that he looked at her once again, and not less favourably. Oh, what a thrill of joy shot through her, awakened by even this intangible and baseless confirmation of her hope that she would learn to win him, through her new and beautiful mamma. "You will not be long dressing, Mrs. Dombey, I presume," said Mr. Dombey. "I shall be ready immediately." "Let them send up dinner in a quarter of an hour." With that Mr. Dombey stalked away to his own dressing room, and Mrs. Dombey went upstairs to hers. Mrs. Skewton and Florence repaired to the drawing room, where that excellent mother considered it incumbent upon her to shed a few irrepressible tears, supposed to be forced from her by her daughter's felicity, and which she was still drying, very gingerly, with a laced corner of her pocket-handkerchief, when her son-in-law appeared. "And how, my dearest Dombey, did you find that delightfulest of cities, Paris?" she asked, subduing her emotion. "It was cold," returned Mr. Dombey. "Gay as ever," said Mrs. Skewton. "Of course." "Not particularly. I thought it dull," said Mr. Dombey. "Fie, my dearest Dombey," archly. "Dull!" "It made that impression upon me, madam," said Mr. Dombey, with grave politeness. "I believe Mrs. Dombey found it dull too. She mentioned once or twice that she thought it so." "Why, you naughty girl!" cried Mrs. Skewton, rallying her dear child, who now entered. "What dreadful heretical things have you been saying about Paris?" Edith raised her eyebrows with an air of weariness, and passing the folding doors, which were thrown open to display the suite of rooms in their new and handsome garniture, and barely glancing at them as she passed, sat down by Florence. "My dear Dombey," said Mrs. Skewton, "how charmingly these people have carried out every idea that we hinted. They have made a perfect palace of the house, positively." "It is handsome," said Mr. Dombey, looking round. "I directed that no expense should be spared, and all that money could do has been done, I believe." "And what can it not do, dear Dombey?" observed Cleopatra. "It is powerful, madam," said Mr. Dombey. He looked in his solemn way towards his wife, but not a word said she. "I hope, Mrs. Dombey," addressing her after a moment's silence with especial distinctness, "that these alterations meet with your approval." "They are as handsome as they can be," she returned, with haughty carelessness. "They should be so, of course, and I suppose they are." An expression of scorn was habitual to the proud face, and seemed inseparable from it, but the contempt with which it received any appeal to admiration, respect, or consideration on the ground of his riches, no matter how slight or ordinary in itself, was a new and different expression, unequalled in intensity by any other of which it was capable. Whether Mr. Dombey, wrapped in his own greatness, was at all aware of this or no, there had not been wanting opportunities already for his complete enlightenment, and at that moment it might have been effected by the one glance of the dark eye that lighted on him, after it had rapidly and scornfully surveyed the theme of his self-glorification. He might have read in that one glance that nothing that his wealth could do, though it were increased 10,000-fold, could win him for its own sake. One look of softened recognition from the defiant woman linked to him, but arrayed with her whole soul against him. He might have read in that one glance that even for its sordid and mercenary influence upon herself, she spurned it, while she claimed its utmost power as her right, her bargain, as the base and worthless recompense for which she had become his wife. He might have read in it that, ever bearing her own head for the lightning of her own contempt and pride to strike, the most innocent allusion to the power of his riches degraded her anew, sunk her deeper in her own respect, and made the blight and waste within her more complete. But dinner was announced, and Mr. Dombey led down Cleopatra, Edith and his daughter following. Sweeping past the gold and silver demonstration on the sideboard as if it were heaped up dirt, and deigning to bestow no look upon the elegancies around her, she took her place at his board for the first time, and sat like a statue at the feast. Mr. Dombey, being a good deal in the statue way himself, was well enough pleased to see his handsome wife immovable and proud and cold. Her deportment being always elegant and graceful, this as a general behaviour was agreeable and congenial to him. Presiding therefore with his accustomed dignity, and not at all reflecting on his wife by any warmth or hilarity of his own, he performed his share of the honours of the table with a cool satisfaction, and the installation dinner, though not regarded downstairs as a great success or very promising beginning, passed off above in a sufficiently polite, genteel, and frosty manner. Soon after tea, Mrs. Skewton, who affected to be quite overcome and worn out by her emotions of happiness arising in the contemplation of her dear child united to the man of her heart, but who, there is reason to suppose, found this family party somewhat dull, as she yawned for 1 hour continually behind her fan, retired to bed. Edith also silently withdrew and came back no more. Thus it happened that Florence, who had been upstairs to have some conversation with Diogenes, returning to the drawing-room with her little work-basket, found no one there but her father, who was walking to and fro in dreary magnificence. "I beg your pardon. Shall I go away, papa?" said Florence, faintly hesitating at the door. "No," returned Mr. Dombey, looking round over his shoulder. "You can come and go here, Florence, as you please. This is not my private room." Florence entered and sat down at a distant little table with her work, finding herself for the first time in her life, for the very first time within her memory from her infancy to that hour, alone with her father as his companion. She, his natural companion, his only child, who in her lonely life and grief had known the suffering of a breaking heart, who in her rejected love had never breathed his name to God at night, but with a tearful blessing heavier on him than a curse, who had prayed to die young, so she might only die in his arms, who had all through repaid the agony of slight and coldness and dislike with patient, unexacting love, excusing him and pleading for him, like his better angel. She trembled, and her eyes were dim. Her figure seemed to grow in height and bulk before her as he paced the room. Now it was all blurred and indistinct, now clear again and plain, and now she seemed to think that this had happened just the same, a multitude of years ago. She yearned towards him, and yet shrunk from his approach. Unnatural emotion in a child, innocent of wrong, unnatural the hand that had directed the sharp plough, which furrowed up her gentle nature for the sowing of its seeds. Bent upon not distressing or offending him by her distress, Florence controlled herself and sat quietly at her work. After a few more turns across and across the room, he left off pacing it, and withdrawing into a shadowy corner at some distance, where there was an easy-chair, covered his head with a handkerchief, and composed himself to sleep. It was enough for Florence to sit there watching him, turning her eyes towards his chair from time to time, watching him with her thoughts, when her face was intent upon her work, and sorrowfully glad to think that he could sleep while she was there, and that he was not made restless by her strange and long forbidden presence. What would have been her thoughts if she had known that he was steadily regarding her, that the veil upon his face, by accident or by design, was so adjusted that his sight was free, and that it never wandered from her face an instant, that when she looked towards him in the obscure dark corner, her speaking eyes, more earnest and pathetic in their voiceless speech than all the orators of all the world, and impeaching him more nearly in their mute address, met his and did not know it. That when she bent her head again over her work, he drew his breath more easily, but with the same attention looked upon her still, upon her white brow, and her falling hair and busy hands, and once attracted, seemed to have no power to turn his eyes away. And what were his thoughts meanwhile? With what emotions did he prolong the attentive gaze covertly directed on his unknown daughter? Was there reproach to him in the quiet figure and the mild eyes? Had he begun to feel her disregarded claims, and did they touch him home at last, and waken him to some sense of his cruel injustice? There are yielding moments in the lives of the sternest and harshest men, though such men often keep their secret well. The sight of her in her beauty, almost changed into a woman without his knowledge, may have struck out some such moments even in his life of pride. Some passing thought that he had had a happy home within his reach, had had a household spirit bending at his feet, had overlooked it in his stiff-necked sullen arrogance, and wandered away and lost himself, may have engendered them. Some simple eloquence distinctly heard, though only uttered in her eyes, unconscious that he read them, as by the deathbeds I have tended, by the childhood I have suffered, by our meeting in this dreary house at midnight, by the cry wrung from me in the anguish of my heart, O Father, turn to me and seek a refuge in my love before it is too late, may have arrested them. Meaner and lower thoughts, as that his dead boy was now superseded by new ties, and he could forgive the having been supplanted in his affection, may have occasioned them. The mere association of her as an ornament with all the ornament and pomp about him may have been sufficient. But as he looked, he softened to her more and more. As he looked, she became blended with the child he had loved, and he could hardly separate the two. As he looked, he saw her face for an instant by a clearer and a brighter light, not bending over that child's pillow as his rival, monstrous thought, but as the spirit of his home, and in the action tending himself no less, as he sat once more with his bowed down head upon his hand at the foot of the little bed. He felt inclined to speak to her, and call her to him. The words, "Florence, come here," were rising to his lips, but slowly and with difficulty. They were so very strange, when they were checked and stifled by a footstep on the stair. It was his wife's. She had exchanged her dinner dress for a loose robe, and unbound her hair, which fell freely about her neck. But this was not the change in her that startled him. "Florence, dear," she said, "I have been looking for you everywhere." As she sat down by the side of Florence, she stooped and kissed her hand. He hardly knew his wife. She was so changed. It was not merely that her smile was new to him, though that he had never seen, but her manner, the tone of her voice, the light of her eyes, the interest and confidence and winning wish to please expressed in all. This was not Edith. "Softly, dear mamma, papa is asleep." It was Edith now. She looked toward the corner where he was, and he knew that face and manner very well. "I scarcely thought you could be here, Florence." Again, how altered and how softened in an instant. "I left here early," pursued Edith, "purposely to sit upstairs and talk with you. But going to your room, I found my bird was flown, and I have been waiting there ever since, expecting its return." If it had been a bird, indeed, she could not have taken it more tenderly and gently to her breast than she did Florence. "Come, dear. Papa will not expect to find me, I suppose, when he wakes," hesitated Florence. "Do you think he will, Florence?" said Edith, looking full upon her. Florence drooped her head and rose and put up her work-basket. Edith drew her hand through her arm, and they went out of the room like sisters. Her very step was different and new to him, Mr. Dombey thought, as his eyes followed her to the door. He sat in his shadowy corner so long that the church clock struck the hour 3 times before he moved that night. All that while his face was still intent upon the spot where Florence had been seated. The room grew darker as the candles waned and went out, but a darkness gathered on his face, exceeding any that the night could cast, and rested there. Florence and Edith, seated before the fire in the remote room where little Paul had died, talked together for a long time. Diogenes, who was of the party, had at first objected to the admission of Edith, and, even in deference to his mistress's wish, had only permitted it under growling protest. But, emerging by little and little from the ante-room, whither he had retired in dudgeon, he soon appeared to comprehend that with the most amiable intentions he had made one of those mistakes which will occasionally arise in the best regulated dogs' minds, as a friendly apology for which he stuck himself up on end between the two, in a very hot place in front of the fire, and sat panting at it, with his tongue out, and a most imbecile expression of countenance, listening to the conversation. It turned at first on Florence's books and favourite pursuits, and on the manner in which she had beguiled the interval since the marriage. The last theme opened up to her a subject which lay very near her heart, and she said, with the tears starting to her eyes, "Oh, mamma, I have had a great sorrow since that day." "You a great sorrow, Florence?" "Yes, poor Walter is drowned." Florence spread her hands before her face and wept with all her heart. Many as were the secret tears which Walter's fate had cost her, they flowed yet, when she thought or spoke of him. "But tell me, dear," said Edith, soothing her, "who was Walter? What was he to you?" "He was my brother, mamma. After dear Paul died, we said we would be brother and sister. I had known him a long time, from a little child. He knew Paul, who liked him very much. Paul said, almost to the last, 'Take care of Walter, dear papa.' I was fond of him." Walter had been brought in to see him, and was there then, in this room. "And did he take care of Walter?" inquired Edith sternly. "Papa, he appointed him to go abroad. He was drowned in shipwreck on his voyage," said Florence, sobbing. "Does he know that he is dead?" asked Edith. "I cannot tell, mamma. I have no means of knowing. Dear mamma," cried Florence, clinging to her as for help, and hiding her face upon her bosom, "I know that you have seen—" Stop, Florence." Edith turned so pale and spoke so earnestly that Florence did not need her restraining hand upon her lips. "Tell me all about Walter first. Let me understand this history all through." Florence related it, and everything belonging to it, even down to the friendship of Mr. Toots, of whom she could hardly speak in her distress without a tearful smile, although she was deeply grateful to him. When she had concluded her account, to the whole of which Edith, holding her hand, listened with close attention, and when a silence had succeeded, Edith said, "What is it that you know I have seen, Florence?" "That I am not," said Florence, with the same mute appeal, and the same quick concealment of her face as before, "that I am not a favourite child, mamma. I never have been. I have never known how to be. I have missed the way, and had no one to show it to me. Oh, let me learn from you how to become dearer to papa, Teach me, you who can so well." And clinging closer to her, with some broken, fervent words of gratitude and endearment, Florence, relieved of her sad secret, wept long, but not as painfully as of yore, within the encircling arms of her new mother. Pale even to her lips, and with a face that strove for composure until its proud beauty was as fixed as death, Edith looked down upon the weeping girl and once kissed her. Then, gradually disengaging herself and putting Florence away, she said, stately and quiet as a marble image, and in a voice that deepened as she spoke, but had no other token of emotion in it, "Florence, you do not know me. Heaven forbid that you should learn from me." "Not learn from you?" repeated Florence in surprise. "That I should teach you how to love or be loved? Heaven forbid!" said Edith. "If you could teach me, that were better, but it is too late. You are dear to me, Florence. I did not think that anything could ever be so dear to me as you are in this little time." She saw that Florence would have spoken here, so checked her with her hand and went on. "I will be your true friend always. I will cherish you as much, if not as well, as anyone in this world could. You may trust in me. I know it, and I say it, dear, with the whole confidence even of your pure heart. There are hosts of women whom he might have married, better and truer in all other respects than I am, Florence, but there is not one who could come here, his wife, whose heart could beat with greater truth to you than mine does." "I know it, dear mamma," cried Florence. "From that first most happy day I have known it." "Most happy day!" Edith seemed to repeat the words involuntarily, and went on. "Though the merit is not mine, for I thought little of you until I saw you, let the undeserved reward be mine in your trust and love. And in this, Florence, on the first night of my taking up my abode here, I am led on, as it is best I should be, to say it for the first and last time." Florence, without knowing why, felt almost afraid to hear her proceed, but kept her eyes riveted on the beautiful face so fixed upon her own. "Never seek to find in me," said Edith, laying her hand upon her breast, "what is not here. Never, if you can help it, Florence, fall off from me because it is not here. Little by little you will know me better, and the time will come when you will know me as I know myself. Then be as lenient to me as you can, and do not turn to bitterness the only sweet remembrance I shall have." The tears that were visible in her eyes as she kept them fixed upon Florence showed that the composed face was but as a handsome mask, but she preserved it and continued, "I have seen what you say and know how true it is, but believe me, you will soon, if you cannot now. There is no one on this earth less qualified to set it right or help you, Florence, than I. Never ask me why, or speak to me about it, or of my husband more. There should be, so far, a division and a silence between us two, like the grave itself." She sat for some time silent, Florence scarcely venturing to breathe meanwhile, as dim and imperfect shadows of the truth and all its daily consequences chased each other through her terrified yet incredulous imagination. Almost as soon as she had ceased to speak, Edith's face began to subside from its set composure to that quieter and more relenting aspect which it usually wore when she and Florence were alone together. She shaded it, after this change, with her hands, and when she arose, and with an affectionate embrace bade Florence good night, went quickly and without looking round. But when Florence was in bed and the room was dark except for the glow of the fire, Edith returned, and saying that she could not sleep, and that her dressing-room was lonely, drew a chair upon the hearth and watched the embers as they died away. Florence watched them too from her bed, until they, and the noble figure before them, crowned with its flowing hair, and in its thoughtful eyes reflecting back their light, became confused and indistinct, and finally were lost in slumber. In her sleep, however, Florence could not lose an undefined impression of what had so recently passed. It formed the subject of her dreams, and haunted her, now in one shape, now in another, but always oppressively, and with a sense of fear. She dreamed of seeing her father in wilderness, of following his track up fearful heights and down into deep mines and caverns, of being charged with something that would release him from extraordinary suffering, she knew not what or why, yet never being able to attain the goal and set him free. Then she saw him dead, upon that very bed, and in that very room, and knew that he had never loved her to the last, and fell upon his cold breast, passionately weeping. Then a prospect opened, and a river flowed, and a plaintive voice she knew cried, "It is running on, Floy. It has never stopped. You are moving with it." And she saw him at a distance, stretching out his arms towards her, while a figure, such as Walter's used to be, stood near him, awfully serene and still. In every vision Edith came and went, sometimes to her joy, sometimes to her sorrow, until they were alone upon the brink of a dark grave, and Edith, pointing down, she looked and saw what? Another Edith lying at the bottom. In the terror of this dream she cried out and awoke. She thought. A soft voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Florence, dear Florence, it is nothing but a dream." And stretching out her arms, she returned the caress of her new mamma, who then went out at the door in the light of the grey morning. In a moment Florence sat up, wondering whether this had really taken place or not, but she was only certain that it was grey morning indeed, and that the blackened ashes of the fire were on the hearth, and that she was alone. So passed the night on which the happy pair came home. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36. Housewarming. Many succeeding days passed in like manner, except that there were numerous visits received and paid, and that Mrs. Skewton held little levees in her own apartments, at which Major Bagstock was a frequent attendant, and that Florence encountered no second look from her father, although she saw him every day. Nor had she much communication in words with her new mamma, who was imperious and proud to all the house but her. Florence could not but observe that, and who, although she always sent for her, or went to her when she came home from visiting, and would always go into her room at night before retiring to rest, however late the hour, and never lost an opportunity of being with her, was often her silent and thoughtful companion for a long time together. Florence, who had hoped for so much from this marriage, could not help sometimes comparing the bright house with the faded dreary place out of which it had arisen, and wondering when, in any shape, it would begin to be a home, for that it was no home then, for anyone. Though everything went on luxuriously and regularly, she had always a secret misgiving. Many an hour of sorrowful reflection by day and night, and many a tear of blighted hope, Florence bestowed upon the assurance her new mamma had given her so strongly, that there was no one on the earth more powerful than herself to teach her how to win her father's heart. And soon Florence began to think, resolved to think would be the truer phrase, that as no one knew so well how hopeless of being subdued or changed her father's coldness to her was, so she had given her this warning, and forbidden the subject in very compassion. Unselfish here, as in her every act and fancy, Florence preferred to bear the pain of this new wound rather than encourage any faint foreshadowings of the truth as it concerned her father, tender of him even in her wandering thoughts. As for his home, she hoped it would become a better one when its state of novelty and transition should be over, and for herself thought little and lamented less. If none of the new family were particularly at home in private, it was resolved that Mrs. Dombey, at least, should be at home in public without delay. A series of entertainments in celebration of the late nuptials, and in cultivation of society, were arranged, chiefly by Mr. Dombey and Mrs. Skewton, and it was settled that the festive proceedings should commence by Mrs. Dombey being at home upon a certain evening, and by Mr. and Mrs. Dombey's requesting the honour of the company of a great many incongruous people to dinner on the same day. Accordingly, Mr. Dombey produced a list of sundry Eastern magnates who were to be bidden to this feast on his behalf, to which Mrs. Skewton, acting for her dearest child, who was haughtily careless on the subject, subjoined a Western list, comprising Cousin Phoenix, not yet returned to Baden-Baden, greatly to the detriment of his personal estate, and a variety of moths of various degrees and ages, who had at various times fluttered round the light of her fair daughter or herself without any lasting injury to their wings. Florence was enrolled as a member of the dinner party by Edith's command, elicited by a moment's doubt and hesitation on the part of Mrs. Skewton, and Florence, with a wondering heart, and with a quick instinctive sense of everything that grated on her father in the least, took her silent share in the proceedings of the day. The proceedings commenced by Mr. Dombey in a cravat of extraordinary height and stiffness, walking restlessly about the drawing-room until the hour appointed for dinner, punctual to which an East India director of immense wealth, in a waistcoat apparently constructed in serviceable deal by some plain carpenter, but really engendered in the tailor's art, and composed of the material called nankeen, arrived and was received by Mr. Dombey alone. The next stage of the proceedings was Mr. Dombey's sending his compliments to Mrs. Dombey with a correct statement of the time, and the next, the East India director's falling prostrate, in a conventional point of view, and, as Mr. Dombey was not the man to pick him up, staring at the fire until rescue appeared in the person of Mrs. Skewton, whom the director, as a pleasant start in life for the evening, mistook for Mrs. Dombey and greeted with enthusiasm. The next arrival was a bank director, reputed to be able to buy up anything, human nature generally, if he should take it in his head to influence the money market in that direction, but who was a wonderfully modest-spoken man, almost boastfully so, and mentioned his little place at Kingston upon Thames, and its just being barely equal to giving Dombey a bed and a chop if he would come and visit it. Ladies, he said, it was not for a man who lived in his quiet way to take upon himself to invite, but if Mrs. Skewton and her daughter, Mrs. Dombey, should ever find themselves in that direction, and would do him the honour to look at a little bit of shrubbery they would find there, and a poor little flower bed or so, and a humble apology for a pinery, and 2 or 3 little attempts of that sort without any pretension, they would distinguish him very much. Carrying out his character, this gentleman was very plainly dressed, in a wisp of cambric for a neckcloth, big shoes, a coat that was too loose for him, and a pair of trousers that was too spare, and mention being made of the opera by Mrs. Skewton, he said he very seldom went there, for he couldn't afford it. It seemed greatly to delight and exhilarate him to say so, and he beamed on his audience afterwards, with his hands in his pockets, and excessive satisfaction twinkling in his eyes. Now Mrs. Dombey appeared beautiful and proud, and as disdainful and defiant of them all as if the bridal wreath upon her head had been a garland of steel spikes put on to force concession from her which she would die sooner than yield. With her was Florence. When they entered together, the shadow of the night of the return again darkened Mr. Dombey's face, but unobserved, for Florence did not venture to raise her eyes to his, and Edith's indifference was too supreme to take the least heed of him. The arrivals quickly became numerous. More directors, chairmen of public companies, elderly ladies carrying burdens on their heads for full dress, Cousin Phoenix, Major Bagstock, friends of Mrs. Skewton, with the same bright bloom on their complexion and very precious necklaces on their withered necks. Among these, a young lady of 65, remarkably coolly dressed, as to her back and shoulders, who spoke with an engaging lisp, and whose eyelids wouldn't keep up well without a great deal of trouble on her part, and whose manners had that indefinable charm which so frequently attaches to the giddiness of youth. As the greater part of Mr. Dombey's list were disposed to be taciturn, and the greater part of Mrs. Dombey's list were disposed to be talkative, and there was no sympathy between them, Mrs. Dombey's list, by magnetic agreement, entered into a bond of union against Mr. Dombey's list, who, wandering about the room in a desolate manner, or seeking refuge in corners, entangled themselves with company coming in, and became barricaded behind sofas, and had doors opened smartly from without against their heads, and underwent every sort of discomfiture. When dinner was announced, Mr. Dombey took down an old lady like a crimson velvet pincushion stuffed with banknotes, who might have been the identical old lady of Threadneedle Street, she was so rich, and looked so unaccommodating. Cousin Phoenix took down Mrs. Dombey. Major Bagstock took down Mrs. Skewton. The young thing with the shoulders was bestowed, and an extinguisher upon the East India Director, and the remaining ladies were left on a view in the drawing-room by the remaining gentlemen, until a forlorn hope volunteered to conduct them downstairs, and those brave spirits with their captives blocked up the dining-room door, shutting out 7 mild men in the stony-hearted hall. When all the rest were got in and were seated, one of these mild men still appeared in smiling confusion, totally destitute and unprovided for, and, escorted by the butler, made the complete circuit of the table twice before his chair could be found, which it finally was, on Mrs. Dombey's left hand, after which the mild man never held up his head again. Now, the spacious dining-room, with the company seated round the glittering table, busy with their glittering spoons and knives and forks and plates, might have been taken for a grown-up exposition of Tom Tiddler's ground, where children pick up gold and silver. Mr. Dombey, as Tiddler, looked his character to admiration, and the long plateau of precious metal frosted, separating him from Mrs. Dombey, whereon frosted cupids offered scentless flowers to each of them, was allegorical to see. Cousin Phoenix was in great force and looked astonishingly young, but he was sometimes thoughtless in his good humour, his memory occasionally wandering like his legs, and on this occasion caused the company to shudder. It happened thus. The young lady with the back, who regarded Cousin Phoenix with sentiments of tenderness, had entrapped the East India Director into leading her to the chair next him, in return for which good office she immediately abandoned the Director, who, being shaded on the other side by a gloomy black velvet hat surmounting a bony and speechless female with a fan, yielded to a depression of spirits and withdrew into himself. Cousin Phoenix and the young lady were very lively and humorous, and the young lady laughed so much at something Cousin Phoenix related to her that Major Bagstock begged leave to inquire on behalf of Mrs. Skewton (they were sitting opposite, a little lower down) whether that might not be considered public property. "Why, upon my life," said Cousin Phoenix, "there's nothing in it. It really is not worth repeating. In point of fact, it's merely an anecdote of Jack Adams. I dare say my friend Dombey," for the general attention was concentrated on Cousin Phoenix, "may remember Jack Adams. Jack Adams, not Joe, that was his brother. Jack, little Jack, man with a cast in his eye, and slight impediment in his speech, man who sat for somebody's borough. We used to call him in my parliamentary time W.P. Adams, in consequence of his being warming pan for a young fellow who was in his minority. Perhaps my friend Dombey may have known the man." Mr. Dombey, who was as likely to have known Guy Fawkes, replied in the negative, but one of the 7 mild men unexpectedly leaped into distinction by saying he had known him, and adding, "always wore Hessian boots." "Exactly," said Cousin Phoenix, bending forward to see the mild man, and smile encouragement at him down the table. "That was Jack. Joe wore—" "Tops!" cried the mild man, rising in public estimation every instant. "Of course," said Cousin Phoenix. "You were intimate with him." "I knew them both," said the mild man, with whom Mr. Dombey immediately took wine. "Devilish good fellow, Jack," said Cousin Phoenix, again bending forward and smiling. "Excellent," returned the mild man, becoming bold on his success. "One of the best fellows I ever knew." "No doubt you have heard the story," said Cousin Phoenix. "I shall know," replied the bold mild man, "when I have heard your lordship tell it." With that he leaned back in his chair and smiled at the ceiling, as knowing it by heart and being already tickled. "In point of fact, it's nothing of a story in itself," said Cousin Phoenix, addressing his table with a smile and a gay shake of his head, "and not worth a word of preface, but it's illustrative of the neatness of Jack's humour. The fact is, that Jack was invited down to a marriage, which I think took place in Berkshire. "Shropshire," said the bold, mild man, finding himself appealed to. "Was it? Well, in point of fact, it might have been in any shire," said Cousin Phoenix. "So my friend, being invited down to this marriage in any shire," with a pleasant sense of the readiness of this joke, goes, "just as some of us, having had the honour of being invited to the marriage of my lovely and accomplished relative with my friend Dombey, didn't require to be asked twice, and were devilish glad to be present on so interesting an occasion. Goes, Jack, goes." Now, this marriage was, in point of fact, the marriage of an uncommonly fine girl with a man for whom she didn't care a button, but whom she accepted on account of his property, which was immense. When Jack returned to town after the nuptials, a man he knew, meeting him in the lobby of the House of Commons, says, "Well, Jack, how are the ill-matched couple?" "Ill-matched?" says Jack. "Not at all. It's a perfectly fair and equal transaction. She is regularly bought, and you may take your oath he is as regularly sold." In his full enjoyment of this culminating point of his story, the shudder, which had gone all round the table like an electric spark, struck Cousin Phoenix, and he stopped. Not a smile occasioned by the only general topic of conversation broached that day appeared on any face. A profound silence ensued, and the wretched mild man, who had been as innocent of any real foreknowledge of the story as the child unborn, had the exquisite misery of reading in every eye that he was regarded as the prime mover of the mischief. Mr. Dombey's face was not a changed one, and being cast in its mould of state that day, showed little other apprehension of the story, if any, than that which he expressed when he said solemnly, amidst the silence, that it was "very good." There was a rapid glance from Edith towards Florence, but otherwise she remained, externally, impassive and unconscious. Through the various stages of rich meats and wines, continual gold and silver, dainties of earth, air, fire, and water, heaped up fruits, and that unnecessary article in Mr. Dombey's banquets, ice, the dinner slowly made its way, the later stages being achieved to the sonorous music of incessant double knocks, announcing the arrival of visitors, whose portion of the feast was limited to the smell thereof. When Mrs. Dombey rose, it was a sight to see her lord, with stiff throat and erect head, hold the door open for withdrawal of the ladies, and to see how she swept past him with his daughter on her arm. Mr. Dombey was a grave sight behind the decanters, in a state of dignity, and the East India Director was a forlorn sight near the unoccupied end of the table, in a state of solitude, and the Major was a military sight, relating stories of the Duke of York to 6 of the 7 mild men. The ambitious one was utterly quenched, and the bank director was a lowly sight, making a plan of his little attempt at a pinery, with dessert knives, for a group of admirers, and Cousin Phoenix was a thoughtful sight as he smoothed his long wristbands and stealthily adjusted his wig. But all these sights were of short duration, being speedily broken up by coffee and the desertion of the room. There was a throng in the stateroom upstairs, increasing every minute, but still Mr. Dombey's list of visitors appeared to have some native impossibility of amalgamation with Mrs. Dombey's list, and no one could have doubted which was which. The single exception to this rule, perhaps, was Mr. Carker, who now smiled among the company, and who, as he stood in the circle that was gathered about Mrs. Dombey, watchful of her, of them, his chief, Cleopatra, and the Major, Florence, and everything around, appeared at ease with both divisions of guests, and not marked as exclusively belonging to either. Florence had a dread of him, which made his presence in the room a nightmare to her. She could not avoid the recollection of it, for her eyes were drawn towards him every now and then by an attraction of dislike and distrust that she could not resist. Yet her thoughts were busy with other things, for as she sat apart, not unadmired or unsought, but in the gentleness of her quiet spirit, she felt how little part her father had in what was going on, and saw with pain how ill at ease he seemed to be, and how little regarded he was as he lingered about near the door for those visitors whom he wished to distinguish with particular attention, and took them up to introduce them to his wife, who received them with proud coldness, but showed no interest or wish to please, and never, after the bare ceremony of reception, in consultation of his wishes or in welcome of his friends, opened her lips. It was not the less perplexing or painful to Florence that she who acted thus treated her so kindly and with such loving consideration that it almost seemed an ungrateful return on her part even to know of what was passing before her eyes. Happy Florence would have been, might she have ventured to bear her father's company by so much as a look, and happy Florence was, in little suspecting the main cause of his uneasiness, but afraid of seeming to know that he was placed at any disadvantage, lest he should be resentful of that knowledge, and divided between her impulse toward him and her grateful affection for Edith, she scarcely dared to raise her eyes toward either. Anxious and unhappy for them both, the thought stole on her through the crowd that it might have been better for them if this noise of tongues and tread of feet had never come there, if the old dullness and decay had never been replaced by novelty and splendour, if the neglected child had found no friend in Edith, but had lived her solitary life, unpitied and forgotten. Mrs. Chick had some such thoughts too, but they were not so quietly developed in her mind. This good matron had been outraged in the first instance by not receiving an invitation to dinner. That blow partially recovered, she had gone to a vast expense to make such a figure before Mrs. Dombey at home as should dazzle the senses of that lady, and heap mortification mountains high on the head of Mrs. Skewton. "But I am made," said Mrs. Chick to Mr. Chick, "of no more account than Florence. Who takes the smallest notice of me? No one." "No one, my dear," assented Mr. Chick, who was seated by the side of Mrs. Chick against the wall, and could console himself even there by softly whistling. "Does it all appear as if I was wanted here?" exclaimed Mrs. Chick with flashing eyes. "No, my dear, I don't think it does," said Mr. Chick. "Paul's mad," said Mrs. Chick. Mr. Chick whistled. "Unless you are a monster, which I sometimes think you are," said Mrs. Chick with candour, "don't sit there humming tunes. How can anyone with the most distant feelings of a man can see that mother-in-law of Paul's, dressed as she is, going on like that, with Major Bagstock, for whom, among other precious things, we are indebted to your Lucretia Tux?" "My Lucretia Tux, my dear?" said Mr. Chick, astounded. "Yes," retorted Mrs. Chick with great severity, You're Lucretia Tox. I say how anybody can see that mother-in-laws of Paul, and that haughty wife of Paul's, and these indecent old frights with their backs and shoulders, and in short, this at home generally, and on which word Mrs. Chick laid a scornful emphasis that made Mr. Chick start, is, I thank heaven, a mystery to me. Mr. Chick screwed his mouth into a form irreconcilable with humming or whistling, and looked very contemplative. "But I hope I know what is due to myself," said Mrs. Chick, swelling with indignation. "Though Paul has forgotten what is due to me, I am not going to sit here, a member of this family, to be taken no notice of. I am not the dirt under Mrs. Dombey's feet yet. Not quite yet," said Mrs. Chick, as if she expected to become so about the day after tomorrow. "And I shall go. I will not say, whatever I may think, that this affair has been got up solely to degrade and insult me. I shall merely go. I shall not be missed." Mrs. Chick rose erect with these words, and took the arm of Mr. Chick, who escorted her from the room after half an hour's shady sojourn there. And it is due to her penetration to observe that she certainly was not missed at all. But she was not the only indignant guest, for Mr. Dombey's list, still constantly in difficulties, were, as a body, indignant with Mrs. Dombey's list, for looking at them through eyeglasses and audibly wondering who all those people were, while Mrs. Dombey's list complained of weariness, and the young thing with the shoulders, deprived of the attentions of that gay youth, Cousin Phoenix, who went away from the dinner table, confidentially alleged to 30 or 40 friends that she was bored to death. All the old ladies with the burdens on their heads had greater or less cause of complaint against Mrs. Dombey, and the directors and chairmen coincided in thinking that if Dombey must marry, he had better have married somebody nearer his own age, not quite so handsome, and a little better off. The general opinion among this class of gentlemen was, that it was a weak thing in Dombey, and he'd live to repent it. Hardly anybody there, except the mild men, stayed or went away without considering himself or herself neglected and aggrieved by Mr. Dombey or Mrs. Dombey, and the speechless female in the black velvet hat was found to have been stricken mute because the lady in the crimson velvet had been handed down before her. The nature even of the mild men got corrupted, either from their curdling it with too much lemonade, or from the general inoculation that prevailed, and they made sarcastic jokes to one another, and whispered disparagement on stairs and in by-places. The general dissatisfaction and discomfort so diffused itself, that the assembled footmen in the hall were as well acquainted with it as the company above. Nay, the very linkmen outside got hold of it, and compared the party to a funeral out of mourning, with none of the company remembered in the will. At last the guests were all gone, and the linkmen too, and the street, crowded so long with carriages, was clear, and the dying lights showed no one in the rooms but Mr. Dombey and Mr. Carker, who were talking together apart, and Mrs. Dombey and her mother, the former seated on an ottoman, the latter reclining in the Cleopatra attitude, awaiting the arrival of her maid. Mr. Dombey having finished his communication to Carker, the latter advanced obsequiously to take leave. "I trust," he said, "that the fatigues of this delightful evening will not inconvenience Mrs. Dombey to-morrow." "Mrs. Dombey," said Mr. Dombey, advancing, "has sufficiently spared herself fatigue to relieve you from any anxiety of that kind. I regret to say, Mrs. Dombey, that I could have wished you had fatigued yourself a little more on this occasion." She looked at him with a supercilious glance that it seemed not worth her while to protract, and turned away her eyes without speaking. "I am sorry, madam," said Mr. Dombey, "that you should not have thought it your duty." She looked at him again. "Your duty, madam," pursued Mr. Dombey, "to have received my friends with a little more deference. Some of those whom you have been pleased to slight to-night in a very marked manner, Mrs. Dombey, confer a distinction upon you, I must tell you, in any visit they pay you." "Do you know that there is someone here?" she returned, now looking at him steadily. "No, Carker, I beg you do not. I insist that you do not," cried Mr. Dombey, stopping that noiseless gentleman in his withdrawal. "Mr. Carker, madam, as you know, possesses my confidence. He is as well acquainted as myself with the subject on which I speak. I beg to tell you, for your information, Mrs. Dombey, that I consider these wealthy and important persons confer a distinction upon me," and Mr. Dombey drew himself up, as having now rendered them of the highest possible importance. "I ask you," she repeated, bending her disdainful, steady gaze upon him, "do you know that there is someone here, sir?" "I must entreat," said Mr. Carker, stepping forward. "I must beg, I must demand to be released, slight and unimportant as this difference is." Mrs. Skewton, who had been intent upon her daughter's face, took him up here. "My sweetest Edith," she said, "and my dearest Dombey, our excellent friend Mr. Carker, for so I am sure I ought to mention him." Mr. Carker murmured, "Too much honour," "has used the very words that were in my mind, and that I have been dying these ages for an opportunity of introducing. Slight and unimportant, my sweetest Edith and my dearest Dombey, do we not know that any difference between you two—" "No, Flowers, not now." Flowers was the maid, who, finding gentlemen present, retreated with precipitation. "That any difference between you two," resumed Mrs. Skewton, "with the heart you possess in common, and the excessively charming bond of feeling that there is between you, must be slight and unimportant? What words could better define the fact? None. Therefore, I am glad to take this slight occasion, this trifling occasion, that is so replete with nature, and your individual characters, and all that, so truly calculated to bring the tears into a parent's eyes, to say that I attach no importance to them in the least, except as developing these minor elements of soul, and that, unlike most mammas-in-law, that odious phrase, dear Dombey, as they have been represented to me to exist in this, I fear, too artificial world, I shall never attempt to interpose between you at such a time, and never can much regret, after all, such little flashes of the torch of what's-his-name, not Cupid, but the other delightful creature." There was a sharpness in the good mother's glance at both her children as she spoke, that may have been expressive of a direct and well-considered purpose hidden between these rambling words. That purpose, providently to detach herself in the beginning from all the clankings of their chain that were to come, and to shelter herself with the fiction of her innocent belief in their mutual affection and their adaptation to each other. "I have pointed out to Mrs. Dombey," said Mr. Dombey, in his most stately manner, that in her conduct, thus early in our married life, to which I object, and which I request may be corrected. Carker," with a nod of dismissal, "good night to you." Mr. Carker bowed to the imperious form of the bride, whose sparkling eye was fixed upon her husband, and stopping at Cleopatra's couch on his way out, raised to his lips the hand she graciously extended to him in lowly and admiring homage. If his handsome wife had reproached him, or even changed countenance, or broken the silence in which she remained, by one word, now that they were alone, for Cleopatra made off with all speed, Mr. Dombey would have been equal to some assertion of his case against her. But the intense, unutterable, withering scorn with which, after looking upon him, she dropped her eyes, as if he were too worthless and indifferent to her to be challenged with a syllable, the ineffable disdain and haughtiness in which she sat before him, the cold inflexible resolve with which her every feature seemed to bear him down and put him by, these he had no resource against, and he left her, with her whole overbearing beauty concentrating on despising him. Was he coward enough to watch her, an hour afterwards, on the old well staircase, where he had once seen Florence in the moonlight toiling up with Paul? Or was he in the dark by accident, when, looking up, he saw her coming with a light from the room where Florence lay, and marked again the face so changed, which he could not subdue? But it could never alter as his own did. It never, in its utmost pride and passion, knew the shadow that had fallen on his in the dark corner on the night of the return, and often since, and which deepened on it now as he looked up. End of chapter 36.